In addition to using a common API platform of infrastructure and lifecycle for Union Fashion, we're also employing a common governance structure, making sure that some of the steps along the API lifecycle are done in a consistent way, using a Postman collection a similar way as the lifecycle is being managed. In reality, they go hand in hand, because you can't really govern what you can't measure, and you can't measure what you don't have defined and know about. So having a well-defined API lifecycle is pretty essential to actually realizing governance. In addition to the API lifecycle collection, we have this governance collection that uses, like the API lifecycle uses its own environment, making it so that we have our development environment for the API itself, but then we have separate lifecycle and governance environments that help us understand what's happening to each API. Similar to the API lifecycle collection, you pull the API into the environment from the API being managed here within the API. So using this request, you load up this open API into the environment, and then you apply these steps to each API being governed. So you can apply this. First, there's some other infrastructural definitions that need to be in place. We need to, make sure there's a workspace set up, make sure that there's a GitHub organization defined, that we have a repository, we actually have an API that's valid, and then to manage this, Union Fashion's requiring there be a handful of collections always in place for each API being developed. So there's actually you got to have the governance and the lifecycle collection in here present, and then you need to have a documentation, contract, performance, and security testing collections as part of the current governance. And then there's a set of environments that you can use against this, and make sure that there's one for development, one for production, making sure there's environments to store keys and other important things. Then make sure as every API has an owner, there's actually an owner recorded for it. Then we get into the design aspects of the API governance. It actually looks to make sure that it's got a proper title and a description. And then it gets into the paths. We only have one right now, which makes sure that the paths are using words, that these are part of a common vocabulary. And before you can use any new path in production, you have to make sure it's part of the vocabulary. We're not going to use acronyms or other cryptic things as part of our API design process. So this is the first step in an overall governance, to make sure APIs are well designed from a path perspective. Then we can manage our parameters. Are all of our parameters using camel case? Are all of them have descriptions? Are request bodies properly defined? Do our responses have 200 status codes, 500? And then are we using our verbs properly? Do all of our methods have names, summaries, and other things? So this goes through the overall design of the API, just looking for consistent things across the general info, paths, methods, and schema for your API. Then we move beyond design and we get into mocks. You can check to see if there's a mock server deployed for each API in a production or development environment. And then we look for using the API gateway to see if an actual API has been deployed for an API into production or for development purposes yet. And then we look for, is there an API plan? Is there an API key? We're looking for contract security and performance testing outputs. Each of the tests that have been set up as part of these collections record their results in the environment for the individual API. And then this governance collection just looks for those tests outputs to be present. If they're not present, those tests will fail. So it also looks to see if there's a monitoring set up for all three of these collections, making sure contracts, performance, and securities are happening on a schedule and being run from multiple regions. and then it scans and looks across the support infrastructure to make sure that the roadmap's up to date, the change log is being updated, and looks for any current issues, as well as make sure that there's some licensing in place for each API to make sure it's being properly licensed before it goes out the door. And then there's a set of reports that allow us to visualize the outline for the governance using Postman Visualizer, and you can see what items you've checked off and which ones you haven't checked off from the list for each API. And then you can publish that to GitHub, the governance outline to GitHub. That's what you'll find here under the details for the API. This is the overall governance that's in place right now, auto-generated from this collection, so that this is always up to date as an outline. But also you can, like the API lifecycle collection, you can view it as an actual documentation. So we're going to republish that real quick and it'll work. And that's the governance piece of it. Like the API lifecycle, the governance and API lifecycle work hand in hand, but they both have the same purpose. Their purpose is to govern the API, whatever APIs are being managed as part of the workspace. So these two collections live across all workspaces, and they're applied to the individual API's workspace and the artifacts that are in here, and make sure that everything's being properly set up and done.